Spring break was supposed to be the best week of their lives. 3 college friends had been planning this trip for months, saving every penny they could from their part-time jobs. They had dreams of sandy beaches, warm sunshine, and memories that would last forever. But sometimes the most innocent adventures can turn into something no one ever expects. Meet our 3 friends. First, there was Amy, a 20-year-old studying psychology at the local state university. She was the kind of person everyone trusted. Her friends often came to her for advice because she was always careful and thought things through. Amy never did anything wild or dangerous. She was the one who always reminded everyone to text their parents and stay together as a group. Then there was David, Amy's boyfriend of 2 years. He was 21 and studying business. David was popular on campus because he was on the swimming team. He had won several competitions and was known for being strong and athletic. Despite his success in sports, David was actually quite shy and preferred spending quiet evenings with Amy, rather than going to big parties. The third member of their group was Lisa, Amy's roommate. She was 19 and working hard in her pre-med classes, dreaming of becoming a doctor someday. Lisa had never been on a spring break trip before. She usually spent her breaks studying or working extra hours at her campus job. This trip was going to be her first real adventure away from books and homework. The 3 friends had chosen a beautiful resort called Sunset Paradise in Mexico. They found it online after weeks of comparing prices and reading reviews. The photos showed crystal blue water, white sand beaches, and palm trees swaying in the breeze. Most importantly, it fit their tight budget. They booked a single room with 3 beds to save money, and each of them contributed equally to cover the costs. For months leading up to the trip, they planned every detail. Amy made lists of what to pack and researched the local weather. David looked up fun activities they could do together, like snorkeling and beach volleyball. Lisa practiced her basic Spanish using a phone app, wanting to be able to communicate with the local people they would meet. The excitement built as March approached. They counted down the days in their shared calendar. Amy's mother, who worked as a police officer before retiring, gave them safety tips about traveling to another country. She reminded them to stay together, keep copies of their passports, and always let someone know where they were going. Finally, March 12th arrived. The 3 friends met at the airport at dawn, their suitcases packed with swimwear, sunscreen, and high hopes. The flight felt like it took forever, but they spent the time looking through travel guides and taking selfies. When they finally landed in Mexico, the warm air hit their faces as they stepped off the plane. After months of cold winter weather, back home the sunshine felt like pure magic. The taxi ride to their resort took them through busy streets filled with colorful buildings and friendly people. Lisa practiced her Spanish with the driver, who smiled and encouraged her efforts. David took photos of everything through the window, while Amy double-checked their reservation details on her phone. When they arrived at Sunset Paradise Resort, it looked even better than the pictures online. The lobby was decorated with beautiful tiles and tropical plants. The staff welcomed them with cold drinks and warm towels. At exactly 3:47 in the afternoon, they checked into their room, and the security cameras captured their smiling faces as they walked through the lobby with their luggage. Their room was perfect. It had a view of the ocean, and they could hear the waves from their balcony. The 3 beds were comfortable, and there was enough space for all their belongings. They immediately started unpacking, hanging up their clothes and setting up their phones to charge. Amy put their passports in the room safe, just like her mother had taught her. The first day was everything they had dreamed about. They spent hours on the beach building sandcastles and playing in the waves. David showed off his swimming skills while Amy and Lisa relaxed on beach chairs, reading magazines they had brought from home. They tried tropical drinks with little umbrellas and took dozens of photos to share with friends back at college. That evening, they explored the resort grounds. There were several restaurants, a gift shop, and even a small dance area where other guests were having fun. They felt safe and happy, surrounded by families and other college students who were also on spring break trips. The next day, March 13th, was just as wonderful. They woke up early to watch the sunrise from their balcony. The sky turned beautiful, shades of pink and orange as the sun came up over the ocean. They ate breakfast at the resort restaurant, trying local foods they had never tasted before. Lisa was proud that she could order in Spanish, and the waiter complimented her pronunciation. They spent the day exploring beyond the resort. They walked through the nearby town, bought souvenirs for their families, and visited a local market where vendors sold handmade crafts and fresh fruit. David bargained for a colorful blanket to take home, while Amy bought postcards to send to her parents. Lisa found a beautiful necklace made by a local artist. Everything felt perfect and safe. The people they met were kind and helpful. Other tourists smiled and waved when they passed on the street. The three friends felt like they were living in a travel magazine, experiencing the adventure of a lifetime. On the evening of March 14th, their third day at the resort, they decided to have a special dinner. They had been saving money by eating simple meals, but this night they wanted to celebrate their friendship and their amazing trip. They chose the resort's nicest restaurant, right on the beach where they could watch the sunset while they ate. The restaurant was beautiful, with tables set up in the sand and string lights hanging overhead. They arrived at 8:30 in the evening, just as the sun was beginning to set. The waiter seated them at a table with a perfect view of the ocean. They ordered their favorite foods and took photos of their dinner to share with friends back home. During dinner, they talked about how much fun they were having and made plans for their remaining days. David wanted to try deep-sea fishing. Amy hoped to visit a local museum she had read about. Lisa wanted to spend more time practicing Spanish with the resort staff. They were already talking about planning another trip together the following year. The restaurant staff later remembered them clearly because they seemed so happy and well-behaved. Unlike some other spring break groups who got too loud or drank too much, these three friends were polite and respectful. They laughed together and seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company. The waiter said they left a good tip and thanked him in both English and Spanish. After dinner, around 10:15 in the evening, they decided to take a walk on the beach. The moon was bright that night, creating a beautiful silver path across the water. Security cameras at the resort captured them walking toward the beach access path behind their hotel. They looked relaxed and happy, with Amy carrying her small purse and all three of them wearing the casual clothes they had put on for dinner. The beach behind the resort was peaceful and beautiful. During the day, it was usually crowded with guests, but at night it became quiet and romantic. Many couples liked to walk there under the stars. There was a secluded cove about a 10-minute walk from the main resort area, where guests often went to watch the waves and enjoy the peaceful atmosphere. At 10:22 p.m., the final security camera captured all three friends walking along the moonlit beach, heading in the direction of that quiet cove. They appeared to be talking and laughing, completely unaware that this would be the last time anyone would see them alive. Back in their room, their belongings waited for their return. Lisa's medical textbooks were stacked neatly on the desk where she had been studying between beach activities. David's swimming goggles sat on the nightstand next to his phone, which was plugged in and charging. Amy's carefully organized suitcase contained the souvenirs they had bought for their families, along with the postcard she planned to mail the next day. The next morning, March 15th, started like any other day at the resort. Housekeeping staff began their rounds cleaning rooms and changing sheets for guests. When the cleaning lady arrived at room 237 at 11 a.m., she knocked on the door as usual. When no one answered, she used her key to enter, expecting to find the room empty or the guest still sleeping. Instead, she found something that made her heart skip a beat. The three beds hadn't been slept in. The sheets were still perfectly made from the day before. The guests' belongings were exactly where they had left them. Phones were still charging on the nightstand, exactly as they had been the night before. The room safe was closed, and when hotel security opened it later, they found the three passports inside, along with extra money the students had brought for emergencies. On Amy's bed, there was a swimsuit laid out for the next day, along with a new bottle of sunscreen she had been excited to try. David's swimming shorts were folded neatly on his bed, ready for their planned beach day. Lisa had left her Spanish phrase book open on the desk, bookmarked to a page about ordering food. The only things missing from the room were the clothes they had worn to dinner the night before, and Amy's small crossbody purse that she always carried when they went out. Everything else remained untouched, as if the three friends had simply vanished into thin air. The housekeeping staff immediately reported the situation to hotel management. At first, the managers weren't too concerned. Sometimes guests stayed out all night and came back in the morning. Maybe the three friends had met other travelers and decided to continue their party somewhere else. Spring break guests sometimes did unexpected things, but as the hours passed and there was still no sign of Amy, David, and Lisa, the situation began to feel more serious. Their families back home started calling the hotel when the students didn't answer their phones. The three friends were responsible people who always stayed in touch with their parents, especially when traveling in another country. By the time their checkout day arrived on March 16th, hotel management knew something was wrong. The three friends had missed their scheduled departure, and their belongings were still in the room exactly as they had been left 2 days earlier. It was time to call the police and begin the search for 3 college students who had simply disappeared into the warm Mexican night. When 3 college students fail to return to their hotel room after a beach walk, their disappearance sets off a chain of events that would change multiple families forever. What started as a missing persons report would soon become something much more serious, revealing troubling secrets about the very place where the students had felt so safe. The first person to truly understand something was wrong was Amy's mother, Patricia. Back home, she had been expecting daily check-ins from her daughter. Amy was the type of person who called her parents every evening when she traveled, sharing stories about her day and the new things she had experienced. When Amy's usual evening call didn't come on March 15th, Patricia felt a knot forming in her stomach. Patricia tried calling Amy's phone several times, but each call went straight to voicemail. She told herself not to worry. Maybe Amy was having too much fun to remember to call. Maybe the phone battery had died. Young people sometimes forgot about time when they were on vacation. But deep in her heart, Patricia knew her daughter, Amy, was responsible. She would never go a whole day without calling, especially not when she was in another country. By the morning of March 16th, Patricia couldn't wait any longer. She called the resort directly, asking to speak with her daughter. The hotel staff politely informed her that the guests in room 237 had not been seen since March 14th, and their belongings were still in the room. That's when Patricia's worst fears began to feel real. Meanwhile, David's parents were experiencing the same growing panic. His father, Robert, was a construction worker who had saved for months to help pay for his son's spring break trip. David's mother, Helen, worked as a nurse at the local hospital. They had raised David to be responsible and trustworthy. Like Amy, David always stayed in touch when he traveled. His silence for 2 days was completely unlike him. Lisa's parents were even more worried because this was their daughter's first big trip away from home. Her mother, Grace, was a teacher who had been nervous about letting Lisa go to Mexico in the first place. Her father, Michael, owned a small auto repair shop and had worked extra hours to help Lisa afford the vacation. They had made Lisa promise to call them every single day. When 2 days passed with no word from their daughter, they knew something terrible had happened. On March 18th, all 3 families made the same difficult decision. They booked emergency flights to Mexico, leaving their jobs and responsibilities behind to search for their missing children. The parents had never met each other before, but they quickly bonded over their shared fear and determination to find their kids. Patricia, Amy's mother, took charge of the group. Her background in police work had taught her how to handle crisis situations. She knew that time was critical in missing persons cases. Every hour that passed made it harder to find people who had disappeared. She also knew that sometimes local authorities in tourist areas didn't take missing person reports as seriously as they should, especially when the missing people were young tourists. When the parents arrived at the resort, they immediately sensed that something wasn't right about how the hotel staff was handling the situation. The manager, a well-dressed man who spoke perfect English, seemed more concerned about the resort's reputation than about finding the missing students. He kept suggesting that the 3 friends had probably just decided to explore other parts of Mexico without telling anyone. The parents found this explanation impossible to believe. They knew their children. Amy, David, and Lisa were not the type of people who would just disappear without a word. They were responsible young adults who understood the importance of staying in touch, especially when traveling in a foreign country. The local police had started a basic investigation, but their efforts seemed half-hearted. They interviewed a few hotel staff members and took some notes, but they didn't seem to be treating the case with the urgency it deserved. The lead detective, a tired-looking man who barely spoke English, kept insisting that young tourists often wandered off and came back on their own after a few days. Frustrated by the slow pace of the official investigation, Patricia made a decision that would change everything. She used her savings to hire a private investigator, a former federal police officer named Carlos Mendoza. Carlos had worked on many missing persons cases throughout Mexico, and he had connections with local law enforcement that could help speed up the search. Carlos was different from the local police. He took the case seriously from the moment he met the families. He spoke excellent English and had experience working with American families whose loved ones had gone missing in Mexico. More importantly, he understood that 3 responsible college students don't just vanish without leaving some kind of trail. The first thing Carlos did was expand the search beyond the resort grounds. While the local police had focused mainly on the immediate area around the hotel, Carlos organized searches of the entire coastline. He hired local fishermen and boat owners to help search the waters. He contacted other hotels and restaurants in the area to see if anyone had seen the 3 students. Within days of starting his investigation, Carlos began finding clues that the police had missed. 2 miles down the beach from the resort, a local woman who collected shells every morning found a pair of women's sandals washed up on the shore. When the families saw the sandals, Amy's mother immediately recognized them as the ones her daughter had been wearing in her last photo. The discovery of Amy's sandals was both heartbreaking and encouraging. It was the first real evidence that something had happened to the students, but it also gave the search teams a better idea of where to focus their efforts. Carlos organized more intensive searches of the coastline in both directions from where the sandals were found. As Carlos continued his investigation, he began interviewing resort staff members more thoroughly than the police had done. Many of the workers were initially reluctant to talk, but Carlos's gentle approach and his ability to speak Spanish fluently helped them feel more comfortable. Slowly, a different picture of the night the students disappeared began to emerge. Several staff members mentioned seeing strangers on the beach that night. These weren't resort guests or local people they recognized. They were described as men who seemed out of place, walking along the beach areas where tourists usually went. Some workers said they had noticed these same suspicious men hanging around the resort on other occasions, but they had been told by management not to bother the guests about it. One of the most important witnesses was an elderly groundskeeper who worked the night shift. He had been trimming plants near the beach access path around the time the students would have been walking to the secluded cove. He told Carlos that he had heard voices coming from the beach around 11 p.m. that night, but they weren't the happy, laughing voices of people having fun. They sounded urgent, maybe even frightened. The groundskeeper also mentioned something that made Carlos's blood run cold. He had seen a boat without lights leaving the area around 11 p.m. on March 14th. In his many years working at the resort, he had never seen a boat operating without lights at night in that area. Boats were supposed to have lights for safety reasons, especially near swimming areas where tourists might be in the water. When Carlos shared this information with local fishermen, several of them confirmed that they had also noticed unusual boat activity in recent months. Boats coming and going at strange hours, always without proper lighting, always in areas where tourists like to walk on the beach. The fishermen had assumed it was none of their business, but now they began to wonder if these mysterious boats were connected to the students' disappearance. As the investigation continued, Carlos discovered something that shocked everyone involved. The resort had experienced other disappearances in the past 2 years, 3 separate incidents where guests had simply vanished, leaving their belongings behind. In each case, the local authorities had concluded that the missing people had left voluntarily, perhaps to explore other parts of Mexico or to avoid returning home for personal reasons. But when Carlos looked more closely at these previous cases, He found disturbing similarities to what had happened to Amy, David, and Lisa. In each instance, the missing people were young, responsible individuals who had no history of reckless behavior. In each case, their personal belongings, including money and identification, had been left behind in their hotel rooms. And in each case, the investigation had been closed quickly without finding any real evidence of where the missing people had gone. Even more troubling was Carlos's discovery that several resort staff members had been instructed not to cooperate fully with investigators. Some workers told him privately that they had been warned they could lose their jobs if they talked too much about incidents at the resort. Others mentioned that certain areas of the resort grounds were off-limits to regular staff, and they had been told never to go there or ask questions about what happened in those areas. The parents were horrified to learn that their children had unknowingly walked into a situation where other people had disappeared under similar circumstances. They couldn't understand how a resort could continue operating normally when guests kept vanishing without explanation. They began to suspect that there was much more to their children's disappearance than a simple case of tourists getting lost or deciding to leave on their own. Patricia used her police contacts back home to put pressure on higher levels of the Mexican government. She reached out to the American embassy, demanding that they take the case more seriously. She organized social media campaigns with the hashtag #FindMeDavidLisa, sharing photos of the three friends and asking for anyone with information to come forward. The social media campaign began to gain attention from news outlets back in the United States. Local television stations picked up the story, interviewing the parents and showing photos of the missing students. The story resonated with other parents who could imagine themselves in the same terrifying situation. As media attention grew, pressure mounted on both the Mexican authorities and the resort management to provide answers. The resort's parent company, which owned several hotels throughout Mexico, began to worry about the negative publicity. Tourism was their main source of income, and stories about missing guests could seriously damage their business. By early May, 2 months after the disappearance, the official search efforts were being scaled back. The local police announced that they had exhausted all reasonable leads and suggested that the case be reclassified as a voluntary disappearance. They theorized that the three students had decided to stay in Mexico, perhaps working illegally, or living off the grid for reasons known only to themselves. The families refused to accept this explanation. They knew their children would never put them through this kind of anguish voluntarily. Patricia, Robert, Helen, Grace, and Michael made a pact to never give up searching. They increased the reward money to $100,000, hoping that a larger sum might encourage someone with information to come forward. Carlos continued his investigation even as official interest waned. He spent his own money to keep searching, moved by the family's dedication and convinced that the truth was still out there waiting to be discovered. He maintained a network of contacts throughout the region, asking them to keep their eyes and ears open for any information about the missing students. The parents took turns staying in Mexico to continue the search, while others returned home to work and earn money to fund the ongoing investigation. They created a schedule so that at least one family member was always present, keeping pressure on local authorities and maintaining relationships with Carlos and his network of informants. As spring turned into summer, the families began to lose hope of finding Amy, David, and Lisa alive. But they never lost their determination to find out what had happened to their children. They knew that somewhere in the beautiful coastal region where their kids had gone to have the time of their lives, there were answers waiting to be discovered. They just had to keep looking until someone was willing to tell the truth. 5 months had passed since Amy, David, and Lisa disappeared from the beach that warm March evening. The families had returned home, but their hearts remained in Mexico. They continued working with Carlos, the private investigator, sending money when they could and staying in touch through daily phone calls. The case had grown cold in the eyes of local authorities, but for the families, every day felt like a lifetime of waiting for answers. Back at the Sunset Paradise Resort, life had returned to what management called normal. New guests arrived every week, laughing and excited about their vacations, unaware of the tragedy that had occurred just months before. The resort staff had been instructed to avoid discussing the missing students with guests. The official story was that 3 tourists had simply chosen to extend their stay in Mexico and travel independently. But for one resort employee, the disappearance of the 3 college students had never stopped bothering him. Carlos Vega was a quiet man who had worked maintenance at the resort for 8 years. He was known among his co-workers as someone who kept to himself and did his job well. Carlos was in his 40s, with graying hair and weathered hands that showed years of hard work. He had 2 teenage daughters at home and worked extra hours whenever possible to save money for their education. Unlike many of his co-workers, Carlos had been paying attention when the students went missing. He remembered seeing them around the resort during their stay. They had been polite and friendly, always saying hello when they passed him in the hallways. Amy had even asked him in broken Spanish about the best places to buy souvenirs for her family. The 3 friends had seemed like good kids, the kind of young people who reminded him of his own daughters. When the students disappeared, Carlos had been questioned briefly by the police, just like all the other staff members. He told them he hadn't seen anything unusual, which was true at the time. But as weeks and months passed, Carlos began to notice things around the resort that didn't seem right. There were areas he was told never to clean or maintain. There were storage buildings on the back lot that he was specifically instructed to avoid. Carlos had worked at the resort long enough to know that every building and storage area required regular maintenance. In the humid coastal climate, buildings needed constant attention to prevent mold and decay. But there were several structures on the resort property that seemed to be off limits to the maintenance staff. When Carlos asked his supervisor about these areas, he was told they were being handled by outside contractors and weren't his responsibility. This explanation might have satisfied someone else, but Carlos was a thorough worker who took pride in his job. It bothered him that there were parts of the resort property that he wasn't allowed to maintain properly. He had seen what happened to buildings that weren't cared for in the coastal environment. They deteriorated quickly, becoming unsafe and expensive to repair. As time passed, Carlos began to notice other odd things around the resort. Sometimes he would see unfamiliar men in expensive clothes talking quietly with resort management. These weren't typical guests or vendors. They arrived in luxury cars and seemed to conduct business in private offices away from the main guest areas. Carlos had learned to be observant during his years of maintenance work. Noticing details and potential problems was part of his job. One thing that particularly bothered Carlos was the behavior of some of his supervisors. In the months following the student's disappearance, several managers seemed nervous and stressed. They were quicker to anger and more demanding about keeping certain areas of the resort restricted. Carlos began to suspect that the missing students weren't the only unusual thing that had happened at the resort. On August 15th, 5 months after Amy, David, and Lisa had vanished, Carlos received an assignment that would change everything. His supervisor handed him a work order to clean out an old storage facility on the back lot of the resort property. The building had been unused for years, and management had decided it was time to clear it out and prepare it for demolition. Carlos had always wondered about this particular building. It was located in a remote area of the resort grounds, far from the guest areas and hidden behind a grove of palm trees. The building was old and weathered, but it had always been kept locked. In his 8 years at the resort, Carlos had never been inside it, and he had never seen anyone else go in or out of it either. When Carlos arrived at the storage building that morning, he found the door unlocked for the first time. His supervisor had given him the key and told him to remove everything from inside, so that demolition crews could begin their work the following week. Carlos was told to load anything useful into a truck and take it to the resort's main storage area. Anything broken or worthless should be thrown away. The building was larger inside than it appeared from the outside. It was filled with old furniture, broken equipment, and boxes of various sizes. The air inside was stale and humid, with a strange smell that Carlos couldn't quite identify. He opened the few small windows to let in fresh air and began sorting through the accumulated items. Most of what Carlos found was exactly what he expected in an old storage building. There were broken chairs that could be repaired, old linens that needed washing, and boxes of dishes and equipment that might still be useful. He worked methodically, sorting items into piles and loading the useful ones onto his cart to take outside. As Carlos worked deeper into the building, he came across a large industrial freezer pushed against the back wall. This surprised him because The building had no electricity, and the freezer had obviously been sitting unused for a long time. But something about the freezer caught his attention. While everything else in the building was covered with dust and showed signs of age, the freezer looked different. The lock on the freezer appeared to be much newer than the rest of the unit. There were also fresh scratches around the edges of the door, as if someone had been opening and closing it recently. Carlos examined the freezer more closely and realized that someone had definitely been accessing it, even though the building was supposed to be abandoned. Carlos tried to open the freezer, but the new lock held it firmly closed. He looked around the building for tools and found an old crowbar among the discarded items. Part of him wondered if he should just report the locked freezer to his supervisor and let someone else deal with it. But his curiosity was stronger than his caution. If the freezer contained something valuable, his supervisors would want to know about it. It took Carlos several minutes to work the crowbar around the edges of the freezer door. The lock was strong, but the metal around it was old and finally gave way under pressure. As the freezer door swung open, Carlos immediately noticed a terrible smell that made him step back and cover his nose. At first, Carlos thought the smell might be from old food that had been left in the freezer. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Inside the freezer were 3 human bodies in advanced stages of decomposition. Even though the bodies were badly deteriorated, Carlos could see personal items that made his heart race. With recognition, there was a silver bracelet on one of the bodies that looked familiar. Carlos remembered seeing Amy wearing a similar bracelet when she had asked him about souvenir shopping. On another body, he could see what appeared to be a class ring. David had been proud of his swimming achievements and often wore his championship ring. The third body wore glasses that reminded Carlos of the ones Lisa had worn during her stay at the resort. Carlos stumbled backward from the freezer, his mind racing with the horrible realization of what he had discovered. These weren't just any bodies. These were the 3 missing college students that everyone had been searching for. They hadn't run away to explore Mexico on their own. They hadn't decided to stay in the country illegally. They had been here at the resort all along, hidden in a storage building that no one was allowed to enter. The discovery hit Carlos like a physical blow. He thought about his own daughters, young women not much different from Amy and Lisa. He thought about the parents who had come to the resort, desperately searching for their children while their bodies were hidden just a few hundred yards away from where the families had stayed. Carlos's first instinct was to run from the building and pretend he had never seen anything. He had a family to protect, and he knew that discovering something this terrible could put him in danger. But as he looked at the 3 bodies in the freezer, he knew he couldn't walk away. These young people deserved justice, and their families deserved to know the truth about what had happened to their children. Carlos carefully closed the freezer door and left the storage building, his hands shaking as he locked it behind him. He needed to think carefully about what to do next. If he reported his discovery to his supervisors at the resort, there was a chance they were involved in whatever had happened to the students. If he went to the local police, he worried they might not take the case seriously, or might even be connected to the cover-up. After hours of agonizing over his options, Carlos made a decision that would require tremendous courage. He would contact both the local police and the private investigator that the families had hired. By reporting to both authorities simultaneously, he hoped to ensure that the discovery couldn't be hidden or ignored. That evening, Carlos called the local police station and reported finding 3 bodies in the resort storage building. The desk officer sounded skeptical at first, but when Carlos described the location and the condition of what he had found, the tone of the conversation became more serious. The officer told Carlos that investigators would be sent to the scene the following morning. But Carlos didn't stop there. He had remembered hearing other resort workers mention the private investigator named Carlos Mendoza, who had been working with the families. Using his limited English and some help from a co-worker who spoke better English, Carlos managed to find contact information for the investigator. When Carlos called Mendoza and explained what he had discovered, the investigator immediately understood the significance of the find. Mendoza had been searching for these 3 students for months. and he knew that this discovery would finally provide the answers that the families desperately needed. Mendoza also understood something that Carlos might not have realized. By reporting the discovery to both local police and the private investigator simultaneously, Carlos had made it impossible for anyone to hide or destroy the evidence. Word of the discovery would reach the families and the media before anyone could interfere with the scene. That night, Carlos couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what he had seen in that freezer and what it meant for the families who had been searching for their children. He also worried about his own safety and that of his family. By coming forward with this information, he had potentially put himself in conflict with powerful people who had wanted this secret to stay buried forever. But Carlos also felt a sense of relief. For months, he had sensed that something wasn't right at the resort where he worked. Now he knew what that something was, and he had taken the first step toward bringing the truth to light. Whatever happened next, the 3 missing students would finally be found, and their families would have answers to the questions that had been haunting them for 5 long months. The phone call that changed everything came early in the morning on August 16th. Patricia was getting ready for work when her phone rang with an international number she didn't recognize. On the other end was Carlos Mendoza, the private investigator she had hired months earlier. His voice was steady but serious as he delivered news that would bring both closure and heartbreak to 3 families. "We found them," Carlos said simply. "We found Amy, David, and Lisa." Patricia's legs gave out, and she sat down hard on her kitchen chair. She had been preparing herself for this moment for months, but nothing could have truly prepared her for hearing those words. Her daughter and her friends had been found, but Patricia could tell from Carlos's tone that this wasn't the reunion she had desperately hoped for. Within hours, all 3 families were on planes to Mexico once again. But this trip felt completely different from their frantic journey 5 months earlier. This time they weren't coming to search. They were coming to finally learn the truth about what had happened to their children and to bring them home. The discovery of the 3 bodies had set off a chain reaction that no one at the resort could control. Carlos Vega's decision to contact both local police and the private investigator simultaneously meant that word of the find spread quickly. By the time resort management learned what had been discovered in their storage building, it was too late to contain the situation. Mexican federal authorities took over the case immediately. The discovery of 3 American tourists who had been missing for months created an international incident that demanded immediate attention. The casual handling of the case by local police was no longer acceptable. Federal investigators, forensic experts, and government officials descended on the resort within hours of the discovery. The scene at the storage building was carefully documented by federal crime scene investigators. Every detail was photographed and cataloged. The freezer was carefully transported to Mexico City for thorough forensic examination. The entire resort was treated as a potential crime scene, with investigators interviewing every staff member and examining every area of the property. For Carlos Vega, the maintenance worker who had made the discovery, life became both terrifying and surreal. He was immediately placed under federal protection after investigators realized that his safety might be in danger. Carlos had done the right thing by reporting his discovery, but that decision had put him and his family at risk from people who had wanted the truth to stay buried. The forensic examination of the 3 bodies took place at Mexico's most advanced facility in the capital city. Despite the deterioration caused by months in the freezer, forensic experts were able to determine several crucial facts about what had happened to Amy, David, and Lisa on that March evening. The evidence showed that all 3 students had suffered serious injuries before they died. The pattern of injuries suggested they had been attacked by multiple people using various objects. David, the swimmer who was known for his strength, showed signs that he had fought back against his attackers. Amy appeared to have tried to shield herself from the attack. Lisa seemed to have been struck while trying to run away from the scene. The forensic evidence painted a picture of 3 young people who had fought desperately for their lives. They hadn't gone quietly or willingly to their fate. They had struggled and fought, which meant their attackers had to work hard to overcome them. This suggested that whatever had happened wasn't a random act of violence, but something planned and carried out by people who were determined to silence the students permanently. As the forensic investigation continued, federal authorities began a comprehensive investigation of the resort and its operations. What they discovered shocked even experienced law enforcement officers who had seen many terrible crimes during their careers. The resort had been serving as a front for a human trafficking operation that had been running for several years. The beautiful beachfront property, with its secluded coves and private access points, provided perfect cover for boats to arrive at night without being noticed by authorities. The resort's management had been allowing traffickers to use their property in exchange for substantial payments. The investigation revealed that the operation worked by bringing victims to the resort area by boat under cover of darkness. The victims were then transported to waiting vehicles and taken to various locations throughout Mexico and potentially beyond. The resort staff had been instructed to ignore any unusual activity they might observe, and several key employees were actively involved in the operation. The 3 college students had unknowingly walked into the middle of one of these operations on the night they disappeared. They had been walking along the beach toward the secluded cove when they witnessed a boat arriving with victims. The students had seen something they weren't supposed to see, and their presence had threatened to expose the entire operation. Federal investigators determined that Amy, David, and Lisa had been captured when they tried to flee after witnessing the trafficking operation. The attackers couldn't risk letting the students return to the resort and report what they had seen. The 3 friends had been taken to a secluded area where they were attacked and killed to prevent them from revealing the criminal operation. The investigation also revealed why the local police investigation had been so inadequate. Several local officers had been receiving payments from the trafficking organization to ignore suspicious activities in the area. They had deliberately conducted a minimal investigation into the students' disappearance because they knew what had really happened and wanted to protect the criminal operation. As the truth about the trafficking operation became clear, federal authorities began making arrests. The first person arrested was Miguel Santos, the resort's head of security. Santos had been the key coordinator between the resort management and the trafficking organization. He had been responsible for ensuring that the resort security cameras malfunctioned on nights when trafficking operations took place. Several other resort employees were arrested, including a bartender who had been drugging drinks of guests who asked too many questions or seemed to notice unusual activities. 2 local police officers were also arrested for accepting bribes and deliberately ignoring evidence of criminal activity in the area. The most shocking arrest was that of the resort owner's son, Antonio. He had been using the resort's financial records to launder money from the trafficking operation. The resort's profits had been artificially inflated with money from criminal activities, and Antonio had been living an expensive lifestyle funded by the suffering of trafficking victims. When the families arrived in Mexico to learn about the investigation's findings, they were overwhelmed by the scope of what had been discovered. Their children hadn't just been victims of random violence. They had been killed because they had accidentally witnessed a large-scale criminal operation that had been harming many other people. Patricia, Amy's mother, struggled with conflicting emotions. She was devastated to learn that her daughter had died in such a terrible way, but she was also proud that Amy had been brave enough to try to flee when she realized she was witnessing something wrong. Even in her final moments, Amy had shown the moral courage that had always defined her character. David's parents, Robert and Helen, were heartbroken to learn that their son had fought so hard against his attackers. David had always been protective of his friends, and it was clear from the evidence that he had tried to defend Amy and Lisa, even when facing impossible odds. His swimming training had made him strong, but he had been outnumbered by people who were willing to do anything to protect their criminal operation. Lisa's parents, Grace and Michael, were devastated that their daughter's first big adventure had ended in such tragedy. But they found some comfort in knowing that Lisa hadn't suffered alone. She had been with her 2 best friends, and the 3 of them had faced their terrible situation together. The trial of the people involved in the trafficking operation began 6 months later. Carlos Vega, the maintenance worker who had discovered the bodies, became the prosecution's star witness. Despite receiving numerous threats against his life and his family, Carlos testified about what he had observed at the resort over the years and how he had made the discovery that finally brought the truth to light. Carlos's testimony was crucial because he could describe patterns of suspicious activity that had been going on at the resort for years. He testified about the restricted areas he had been told never to enter, the mysterious visitors who met with resort management, and the general atmosphere of secrecy that had surrounded certain aspects of the resort's operations. The trial revealed additional details about how the trafficking operation had worked and how many people had been victimized over the years. Prosecutors estimated that hundreds of victims had been trafficked through the resort over a 3-year period. The operation had been incredibly profitable for those involved, which explained why they had been willing to kill 3 innocent students to protect it. Miguel Santos, the security chief, was sentenced to 35 years in prison for his role in the murders and the trafficking operation. The other conspirators received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. The resort owner's son received a 20-year sentence for money laundering and conspiracy. The resort itself was permanently closed and its assets were seized by the Mexican government. The beautiful property that had once welcomed families and young people looking for vacation memories became a symbol of the hidden dangers that can exist in places that seem safe and welcoming. The 3 families used the settlement money they received to establish a foundation dedicated to helping families of missing persons and supporting efforts to combat human trafficking. They named it the Amy David Lisa Foundation, ensuring that their children's names would be associated with efforts to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. Carlos Vega and his family were relocated to the United States under a witness protection program. His courage in coming forward and testifying had made it unsafe for him to remain in Mexico, but American authorities recognized his bravery and helped him start a new life. Carlos found work as a maintenance supervisor at a school district in Texas, where his dedication and integrity were quickly recognized by his new employers. The case led to significant changes in how Mexican authorities handle missing tourist cases and improved cooperation between Mexican and American law enforcement agencies. New protocols were established to ensure that disappearances of foreign visitors receive immediate and thorough investigation. For the families of Amy, David, and Lisa, the end of the legal proceedings brought a measure of closure, but their grief would never fully end. They had finally learned the truth about what happened to their children, and they had seen justice served against those responsible. Most importantly, they had ensured that their children's deaths had meaning by helping to shut down a criminal operation and prevent future victims. The 3 friends were finally laid to rest in their hometown, side by side in a ceremony attended by hundreds of people whose lives they had touched. Their story became a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, truth and justice can prevail when people are willing to do the right thing, no matter the personal cost.